In Unrequited Love, you have open discussions about some of the things you have questions about, like children being assigned a gender or looking at medical transition and things like that, and when that should occur for transgender children. Yes, so I wondered where you found yourself with that.
Well, I think the reality is that people get very upset by this, is that I'm quite conservative about interfering too much with biology. And I think that I'm torn between enormous both empathy and admiration for people who are trans, because that is an enormously difficult thing to live through. I mean, I've known people who've lived through transitions. It's heartbreaking. It makes you realize just how entrenched society's views of gender are. But on the other hand, I think there are certain biological realities, and I'm not sure how far it is possible to change them. I wish it were. I wish it were, for example, possible to reverse aging. I'd be very happy at this stage if we could reverse aging, but we can't. And I think that Botox and plastic surgery have very real limits. So I guess at some level I think we do have to question not how people choose to express themselves. I guess I would still have hoped, and it turned out I was wrong. And my hope had always been that as we had greater equality for women, at the same time that would mean less need for people to be bothered by their biological sex. And that hasn't turned out to be the case, and I honestly don't quite understand why that's so. We know that there are large numbers of people now, many more than there have been, who are acknowledging very strong sense of unhappiness with the gender they've been assigned to. All someone like me can do is acknowledge that, listen to them, support them. But I think you can support people at the same time you can ask. You can question how far and where does this come from?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's a few things, isn't there? I mean, the thing that I think about in terms of for the transgender community at this point at least, and it's something that Catherine McGregor talks about, who's probably one of Australia's most prominent transgender women, and also conservative as well. So, when you talk about gay people, I guess the percentages within the population mean that, a certain percentage of people tend to fit within this particular sexual categorisation. But then for transgender people, traditionally, and even up until this point where the numbers are increasing, it's still a very small percentage. So the likelihood that lots of people in the community would have an opportunity to interact with transgender people and break down some of those barriers is much less.
Probably, although of course there are societies in which there are very clear and understood roles for people who don't fit traditional gender. And that's true actually for most societies outside the industrialised West.
It's the way that the society explains it. I mean, essentially the construction within the society in terms of how they explain a role within the society is what you mean.
Well, I think that there are so many issues bound up in this. And I think that part of the problem is that there are so many varieties of the trans experience, because there are trans people who are very clear that they are not the sex they've been assigned to. If it's a woman, she's very clear she actually wants to present and go through transition to become a man. If it's a man, the reverse. But then there are people who say, I don't want to be restricted by gender at all. I want to be fluid in my gender expression. So that you get both a radical and a conservative expression of trans identities. And it's often complicated because it's not always clear which is which. Now, you mentioned Catherine McGregor. I think that her political conservatism is as one with her gender conservatism. And she's very clear she wants to be a woman in a fairly traditional sense. I know people who are trans who have exactly the opposite view. They say, I don't want to be a woman or a man as they're currently understood. I want to move between the two and to not be identified as either. And I think that part of the confusion for a lot of people is we're never quite sure which person we're talking to.
Well, I know I talked to Professor Jenny Graves, who's at La Trobe University, the
Yes.
geneticist, and we talked about this, and she talked about the potential of we can talk about a biological continuum, in terms of biological sex,
Yes.
and you certainly have people who are, X, Y, and then transgenderism in terms of the genes, that there is a biological reality underneath there for transgender people. It's not just social constructionism. It's not just that we get our gender.
Well, I think Jenny would also. I mean, I have huge respect for Jenny, who
Yes.
We go back a very long way because we know each other from student politics days, actually. But I think she would be very careful to say that there may well be biological genetic explanations, but they're not total explanation, just as the social is not a total explanation. I think the strength of her work is precisely that she's very, very cautious, as I understand it, in any type of simple, here's the answer.
Do you think, though, that the explanation, this is my impression, has become a social constructionist explanation within the community, within, say, the gay community or the transgender community?
I certainly can't speak about what may or may not be the view among people who are trans. I think that this term community becomes very, very misleading because it sort of assumes there is a view. And of course there isn't a view any more than if we talked about Jews in Australia. There's not a view. There are Jews who are passionate defenders of Benjamin Netanyahu's government and Jews who are bitter opponents of it.
Yes.
So I think we have to be very cautious about assuming communities have views, individuals have views, but communities I don't think do.
Some people that would fit within the LGBTQI, and I'm not talking about everyone, but their political beliefs might be more centre-left or left than they're likely to be leaning to conservative
I think,
right.
Mark, there is no evidence for that whatsoever. There is actually counter-evidence, I'm afraid. I wish there weren't. But if you look at the federal parliament, there are more openly homosexuals sitting on the conservative side than on the other side. I happen to think this is a very sad reality, but it is a reality. And we just don't have the data. And of course, we can't have the data because to have the data, we would have to know exactly who is each of those letters. And given that I think sexual and gender identities are fluid, they move over time. Somebody who 10 years ago was in a heterosexual marriage today may be living with someone of the same sex. It becomes very, very difficult. And in fact, it's certainly true that where there have been studies, people who are openly lesbian and gay in the US are much more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. I don't think we have any good data in Australia, and certainly we do have evidence that there is an extraordinary range. And as I say, just look at the current federal parliament.